It is 8:33 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It is the 28th day of July 2026. This is episode 1361 of Bitcoin And. Today, I'm going to be doing the sixth part of the Cathedral Project. Yes, I finally got around to figuring out this particular part, which is honestly, this is one of the most important parts of the whole Cathedral Project. And if you don't know what the Cathedral Project is, essentially it is a thought experiment about agriculture, specifically a constructed, modified silvopasture, which includes trees and pasture. And it is the way that I'm thinking about one of a large tool set when we start talking about the future of agriculture. This Cathedral Project in no way is me trying to say this is the way that agriculture should go and any other ideas are ridiculous. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. This is one idea out of plenty of other really good ideas that seek to figure out a way to get us out of this conventional agriculture. Different ways of thinking about how do we get our food? How do we produce our food? How do we do it in a way that brings beauty and awe back to the human experience of being on the land? And that's sort of the kind of the impetus of the whole Cathedral thought project. So I have done cathedrals 1 through 5. And you can find those at bitcoinandshow.com. That's bitcoinandshow.com. I am going to recap a little bit of what the Cathedral Project is in case you were just, walking into this one like somebody walking into a hornet's nest. So let me start there. Let me start by kind of recapping and give you a reintroduction to the whole cathedral thing. All right, so what is Cathedral? Cathedral is a 1,000-year modified silvopasture project. It's designed as a legacy system that no single generation expects to finish. And why would anybody do this? And this is sort of where you really got to start thinking outside of the box with me. The way we do agriculture today is basically based around return on investment and getting as much as you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can. And it doesn't really matter what happens to the soil health and the local environment around the conventional farming apparatus. And I am not making any moral judgments on our farmers here in the United States, nor anywhere else for that matter. We need the farmers. But the farmers at this point are running on a treadmill, and basically that treadmill is breaking down. They're running out of conveyor belt. The input costs are rising. The soil is degrading. And even farmers that have been in this for a long time, that you could have told them that there's a different way of doing things 20 years ago and they never would have listened to you. Now they're like looking at their lands, and a lot of them are going, oh shit, this isn't good. So this particular project, I want to frame this around essentially 3 laws. Like what governs this 1,000-year silvopasture project? Well, first law, and I'm doing this the way that Isaac Asimov did the robotics laws because it's a really good framework. And if you haven't read the robot novels from Isaac Asimov, I highly recommend that series. It's really good. Plus all the robot novels. I mean, whether you're going and just reading iRobot, or if you're getting into the rest of his novels, I think there's about 4 or 5 of them all together, and they're all really, really good. But the whole thing about it is that Isaac needed to develop a framework in which to describe how the robots essentially behave and why they behave that way, or at least how they behave that way. And I kind of shoehorned that into the Cathedral Project. So this project, as I said, is governed by 3 laws. 1, the land must become more fertile, abundant, and life-giving every single year. Law 2, every square inch must maximize its productivity without violating the first law. And the final law is no synthetic chemistry may be used unless it is necessary to obey the first 2 laws. What this does is it kind of gives me a structure where the application of synthetic chemistries for any reason whatsoever is literally the last thing that you can reach for. So this entire system depends on animals, design, and soil biology, and a whole host of other things. But livestock is involved by moving nutrients and disturbing the land in really controlled ways, while fungi, bacteria, compost preparations, plant roots, and biochar circulate that fertility above and below the ground. Now, Cathedral is designed around connected cycles rather than just making isolated products for sale. Water, carbon, nutrients, animals, plants, biology, even labor and revenue are meant to reinforce one another, not to act as just, separate items that you're trying to plug into a system. They all relate to each other, and that's one of the really important parts of the Cathedral Project. Here in Cathedral VI, we're going to add the energy system that receives biomass and sends heat, electricity, carbon, and other useful products back through those existing cycles. And that's where we are. That's the name of this particular episode is Cathedral VI, the carbon group. Okay. Now, a little pause. If you have not listened to the first 5 episodes of Cathedral, go to bitcoinandshow.com. bitcoinandshow.com. At the top, you will see the word Cathedral. I've grouped all the Cathedral stuff into that tab. So you won't have to go anywhere else on the website. Go to bitcoinandshow.com and you can get to everything, all the episodes, all the small write-ups, everything that I've done for Cathedral so far is at bitcoinandshow.com. And that will give you a framework of what we're about to talk about, because I can't go through the entire system. I've already basically done that in Cathedrals 1 through 5. But one of the most important parts of the Cathedral Project is what we're about to talk about, and it's why I took so long to actually get this one up and running. So I'm calling this episode the Carbon Group. What's the Carbon Group? Well, the Carbon Group is the part of Cathedral that receives biomass like wood chips, well, essentially chipped wood, or, wood, dried leaves, essentially vegetation mass, right? And it converts it. And then it redistributes the resulting energy, heat, and carbon and other products throughout the wider system, as I've said. And it's more than just the electricity power plant part. It's not simply about generating electricity and, mining Bitcoin, which is part of the system. It also produces several useful outputs from the very same feedstock. So the central question of this episode is this: how can Cathedral turn biomass waste into energy, food, soil fertility, useful products, and revenue without wasting the heat or carbon released along the way? So a while back, I built a separate flow chart for myself just to put in all the elements of what the carbon group is. What are its inputs? What does it do with the inputs? And how is processes, when we're processing the inputs, how do those processes relate to each other? Because again, if I start building projects where things are completely separate, then we don't get the possibility to create synergy between the processes. And this entire system, and you'll see this in Cathedral parts 1 through 5, is all about relational processes. Or how do we make processes? How do we find what processes will use the output from another process as an input stream, instead of having all these processes looked at as singular silos that has an input and a waste stream? Because when as humans, we have this tendency to, it's easy to look at something that is an output of a system as two things. One, as a product, and the other thing that comes out of that same process is a waste. And that's it. We just get rid of the waste. That is a problem with the way that we've been taught to live, honestly. And I don't think it's just the West. I think many countries and many cultures don't see waste as potential energy. And that's what things like regenerative agriculture and permaculture kind of seek to rectify. Maybe it's not exactly the end all be all. It was never the goal of permaculture to make sure that, the whole goal of permaculture was to make sure that waste is utilized. That's sort of not what it was designed to do. However, it is a central tenet in permaculture that waste can be reused by other systems as an input, which means it's not waste. It's a valuable product or a valuable input that can be utilized in other situations. But also in the flow chart that I've built, there's also, well, what does the whole thing output? What are the goods, right? So I'm going to kind of describe this flow chart and think about it from all the basic raw inputs are on the left, the process is in the middle, and the outputs are on the right-hand side of the flow chart. And there's just envision all these little boxes with these little different things with arrows dragged. This goes into this, and this feeds back into this, and then there's arrows that basically go to the right-hand side that give us what at the very end of the day, what is produced. So I'm going to start with the inputs. Now, Cathedral is built around the idea that I have for what kinds of trees and animals and grasses and grazing, because it's not just cows on grass, and it's not just like a nut plantation. It's both, right? There's animals, there's trees, there's shrubs, there's everything under the sun, which again, you can get in Cathedrals part 1 through 5. But one of the major elements of this particular design in my mind is I'm just looking at nut trees in the form of the black walnut tree. Reasoning is given in Cathedrals 1 through 5. But the short version is a black walnut tree is very strong. It's very resilient. It gives extremely high quality walnut meat, but even better is the wood that it produces. And I'm talking craft lumber. I'm talking highly sought after wood with beautiful, beautiful patterns. It's like iron. It is durable, but it is one of the most beautiful woods that you will ever see, whether you're making tables or countertops or furniture or whatever. So the wood itself is extremely valuable. And again, what we do with that wood, you can get from Cathedrals 1 through 5. But the nuts that it drops, there's a couple of things that you can't use from it. I mean, humans cannot eat the husk around a black walnut. It's nasty. We can also not eat the walnut shell. That's not good for your gut. So the only thing that comes out of the walnut that we really want is the meat. So we have walnut shells and we have walnut wood or walnut hulls. It's like a fleshy wrapper around the actual walnut shell. It's kind of gross. So we have, during the processing phase of getting the meat out of the walnut, you get a lot of unusable mass. And a lot of people look at it as waste. Goes to a landfill. Not here. There's also the wood pruning that occurs on site. We're talking 1,000 acres. And a good, I would say 360 acres of that is devoted to trees of at least 3 kinds. Actually, I'm going to say about 5 kinds. They're like black walnut, honey locust, black locust, persimmons, and a couple of other trees. Again, reasoning in the earlier cathedral episodes. So pruning has to happen. And when you're talking about 360 acres of trees, that's a lot of wood waste. Yeah, so the pruning has to occur. It's going to occur throughout the year, every year. So there's a constant stream of hardwoods that are coming through that need to be processed. So that's an input. But there's a whole other input stack here, because I'm not going to pay myself for the walnut shells and the walnut hulls for input. I'm not going to buy those as inputs. They're just, I got to get rid of them. I'm also not going to pay somebody to bring me, wood prunings, because I've got to take care of my own wood prunings. However, if this system is located anywhere close to a couple of municipalities, they've got pruning too. And they've got to dispose of that as well. And generally speaking, they have to pay a disposal fee, or they've tried, and a lot of them have failed, but they've tried to set up situations where they can produce or turn that wood into wood chips for the municipality and sell it back to the citizens. And citizens don't care. They're just going to go to Walmart and buy something that came from 1,000 miles away, because that's just the way it is, right? So I've seen several chip yards that are basically abandoned. That's what I'm saying. And yet these municipalities still, they hire companies like Asplin to go clip all the branches away from the power lines, right? And this happens every year. Tons and tons of wood waste, just waiting for something like the Cathedral Project to come along and say, hey, you dump it here and you pay us the tipping fee. It could be, I'm not, and again, there's a lot of things about Cathedral that are not, I don't have a full business plan for this yet, right? This is just fleshing out. This entire series of Cathedral is more about fleshing out what needs to happen or what could happen, rather than exactly what's the tonnage, or what's, how much you're going to charge for the input fee. That comes later, and I'll do episodes on that. But we have the possibility of charging a disposal fee to municipalities for 2 different things. One, they're already chipped wood. Like if you've ever seen an Asplund, it's those big orange trucks that has a major, wood chipper on the back of it, and they just chip the wood so that they can. Essentially, it's more for storage capacity in their main truck than anything else. But they got at the end of their day, they've got to get rid of that chipped waste. I would definitely charge less of a tipping fee for them to tip at a Cathedral Project. That way I can use that input and get revenue for it. Then there's also situations where municipal waste comes in unshipped formats, and I need this shipped. So all of this, whether it's walnut shells, walnut hulls, chipped municipal wood, or unchipped municipal wood and the wood pruning on site, that's 5 input streams, right? All of it needs to be chipped. Or the walnut shells and the walnut hulls, they're pretty much going to be the size that I need. But I need like wood at 3 inches in diameter somewhere, or they call it like 3 inches long, 3 inches wide. Just think of it like that. That's sort of the best format that I can get on the input side. So where does it go? Where does it all go? It goes into drying silos. If it's not chipped, it needs to go into a chipper grinder. And then it's going to go, after it's dried, after this input mass is dried, that feedstock is what I'm going to start referring to it as, goes into something called a gasifier, which I'll get to later. And then that gasifier feeds a generator, which we'll get to later. And a lot of these things generate heat. And instead of looking at that heat generated from the gasifier, which runs very, very hot, and the electrical generator, or the gas generator, which is used to generate electricity, that runs very, very hot as well. And if there's Bitcoin mining involved, which there should be, those miners create heat. And all of that heat is utilized. And then the heat after utilization, it's still hot air. And I can harvest even more heat off of that by sending it to an aquaponics system or a greenhouse or a greenhouse. And if it's done right, you got both. So what are the direct outputs of all of this? In aquaponics, I would get fish and vegetables. In a greenhouse, and this system needs a greenhouse because you're constantly going to be planting trees, which, if you don't know why, cathedrals 1 through 5. So the greenhouse is going to produce not only other vegetables, but mostly it's going to be producing tree seedlings, little saplings, because you're going to need to be replacing trees and bushes and shrubs every year, right? So you need the greenhouse. It's going to produce biochar, which, again, we'll get a little deeper into biochar later on in this episode. But it also produces wood vinegar, which is also we'll talk about later. And then the ultimate product is, the other ultimate product is some Bitcoin. So that's sort of the way this flows. It basically goes from like 5 different inputs, and then it all gets processed, and all of the waste, what would be considered waste in those processes, are harvested to do other functions, including like the gasifier produces CO2. I can use that in the greenhouse because plants like CO2. So even some of the CO2 waste is not waste. It is an input stream that I can utilize. And then the output is fish, plants, biochar, wood vinegar, and Bitcoin, as well as possibly surplus electricity to sell back to municipalities. But I want to go on and talk more about the feedstock streams. So I've already talked to you about walnut shells and hulls, on-site pruning waste, municipal chipped wood, and other municipal wood that would require processing, which I would charge a higher tipping fee for. But what about quality and contamination? How do I know that what I'm getting, it may look like wood, but is it construction waste? This is a problem. And one of the reasons is that pressure treated lumber, it comes with, depending on how it was pressure treated, people could still be using old pressure treated lumber. Or if a house was torn down that was built in the 50s, I guarantee you that there are heavy metals in that wood because that was part of a pressure treatment. It was, arsenic, and there was I can't remember, there's a couple of other ones, but they're sort of considered not as much heavy metals, but definitely in the metal thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even have to be metal. It's essentially things that do not go away even after processing. It's not something that will off gas. It's not something that will just, go away through the processing. So you got to be, this would have to be, you'd be very serious about making sure that the input streams that you're getting, especially when it comes to the municipal waste, it's got to be suitable for gasification and biochar production and treated wood and painted wood and any plastics or dirt or contaminants. That's got to be out. So you got, this system would have to be a situation would have to be something that would be monitored as trucks pull up and say, hey, if you tip and we find, unwanted materials, it is up to you and you better do it. Otherwise you will not be welcome back here ever again. And you will never get another tipping fee if we find plastic jugs. Because I don't want to deal with it. It's like, the rules. It's like, the rules. You know what's acceptable. It is up to you to make sure that what you drop is what we can use, right? So feedstock quality and contamination, critical. And you also need to build a reliable feedstock mix because the carbon group, it shouldn't depend on one single source. Walnut residues, municipal wood, and on-site pruning waste together create a more resilient supply than just pruning waste and walnut shells and hulls only, because I wouldn't have enough, right? But if it's just municipal wood, depending on how large the city is, or even just a small town, that could be like, well, I don't have enough to do all the things that I need to do, right? So there's other considerations too, like on Cathedral, if I start sectioning out little plots of land, like around the trees, and instead of maybe the hedgerows that are supposed to surround each one of the tree lanes, maybe I plant bamboo. Why bamboo? Because it is a very valuable feedstock when it comes to biochar production. In fact, it's one of the all-time best feedstocks that you can have. You think it's like, oh, well, why, pine would be great. Yeah, pine's okay. It really is. It's fine for biochar production, but it's not as dense, right? So, and there's other issues that go on with pine. There's also other issues that go on with other kinds of what we would call trash trees, like this one tree that I hate. There's only one tree I've ever come across in my life that I absolutely hate, and it's called a paradise tree. And if you want to look into it for yourself, go ahead. I hate them. It's the only tree that I hate. It's trash. It's like a giant weed that causes problems. And I can use it as a feedstock, but it's not as good as like, maple chips or pine chips or, oak chips, which I would rather use it for barbecue. But bamboo, it grows fast. It puts on a lot of mass, and I can cut it down and it will grow back. And since I'm keeping, as we'll get into, I'm keeping everything in the Cathedral Project for at least the first 25 years, I'm not depleting anything because of it. But if I found myself in a situation where I'm like, I'm just not getting enough biomass, I can grow it on site. We can figure out a way to get more biomass into that system. So let's get into the chipping, the grinding, the drying, and moisture control, because moisture in the input feedstocks for the carbon group is extremely important. So let's talk about a little bit about feedstock preparation. Why? Why do you need it? Why do you need chips at 3 inches or somewhere around there? Why is moisture an issue for the gasifier? Because it is. The gasifier, it just cannot perform well on irregular, oversized, or excessively wet biomass. Okay, so what does the gasifier do? Let's talk about that in a minute. I know you're going, what? Why the hell are we gasifying, and what the hell is a gasifier? Promise you, I've got you covered. Just let me get through this part. So the gasifier itself really depends on low moisture and a fairly regular input size. And that means that might even have to separate the material. Like pre-chipped goes directly into the drying silos, which is where we'll dry with the heat that's given from all the rest of the systems that are generating heat. And large material must be chipped. Again, that's why we would charge a higher tipping fee, because I got to process that, right? And the chippers that would be on site, I figure, two different kinds of chippers. Your standard professional model, like your professional tree service would use, and something called a tub grinder for large woody material like whole tree stumps, because it is not outside the realm of possibility that somebody brings you a whole tree stump. A tub grinder is a really interesting piece of machinery, and it's actually fairly scary. It's one of those things that if you fall into one, you're probably going to be toast. Right. So it's generally speaking, it's a giant tub. And I mean, like, when I mean giant tub, think of one of those like large above ground circular swimming pools, and multiply that by 2 in diameter, and you'll get to where we're talking about. At the bottom of it is these really scary teeth that basically grind whatever is sitting on top of it. So you dump a tree stump in there, and it goes, the tree stump ends up being rotated around, and every time it comes into contact with a couple of strips of these grinders, it is just shredded down and down and down and down and down. And those pieces would probably have to be even more processed by going through the smaller chipper shredder to get it to the 3-inch size. But this way you can handle big logs, whole tree stumps, that kind of thing. And that's what you would use for the very large stuff that is just too big to pass through a standard pro model. You need electricity and or gasoline and diesel to run these machines. There are electrical versions of these machines. Well, we have an electrical generator on site that is being powered from the very fuel that we're actually chipping. And see how this is all circular. Everything should be as much should be kept in a loop as humanly possible here. So the generator supplies power back to both the chippers. Then you got to move, after you've dried the wood, you've got to move that prepared biomass. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, not dried biomass. You got to move that mass into the drying silos. It's the chipped wood and the walnut shells and the walnut husks, which can be quite wet, right? And you can use, I think, now this is where, am I absolutely certain that what I'm about to say is how the system is going to work? No, it's not. I am not absolutely certain. But I have a sneaky suspicion that your standard agricultural silo that you see on farms around the world would be prime to use as a drying silo for 3-inch chipped wood chips. How does a drying silo work? Well, first of all, it's a huge round metal container with a cone roof. And inside that, the first thing that happens is that there's a false floor with a screen. And underneath that screen is like reinforcements to keep all the weight of everything that's in the drying silo from collapsing onto the cement foundation. So there's this huge air gap underneath these silos, whether it's a grain silo or whatever. They're kind of all built the same, because they also need to control moisture. This is why I'm looking at these ag silos as something that would work very, very well. Underneath, because you've got that air gap, you also have a fan that blows outside air into that space, and it has nowhere to go but straight up through whatever mass is sitting on the false floor that is made out of the screen, and that screen will allow airflow to go up. In this case, just think of this gigantic ag silo filled with a bunch of wood chips with a moisture meter or moisture probes that are put into the wood so that you can monitor what kind of moisture is coming out. And then you basically force all of the heated air from the gasification process and the we'll call it fossil fuel using generator that powers the electrical generator. All of that heat, and from the Bitcoin miners, all of that heat is pumped into the silo. So all that hot air that is generally speaking regarded as waste heat is now working for us, because we got to dry this stuff down to the moisture content of about 14%. So that's where all this mass goes. And it cannot be utilized until the moisture hits somewhere between 12 and 15%. That's sort of the sweet spot. You want some moisture, but too much is going to gum up the works when it comes to the gasification process. What we're left with is the carbon group basically prepares its very own next batch of fuel. Today's energy production, the chips and loads, it all becomes tomorrow's feedstock. And that's how we use the waste heat. Yeah, there's also waste CO2. We'll get to that later. But the waste heat is utilized. Even in the dead of summer, this heat is going to be used to dry all this feedstock down to the appropriate moisture content before it even goes into the gasification process. And that's next, the gasification process and its primary outputs. What is a gasifier? Well, I talk about it in Cathedrals 1 through 5, but the gasification process is the ability to, many people will say, burn wood to get the product that we're interested in out of it. That's not exactly what's going on. There's another word that makes better sense to use: pyrolysis. Pyro meaning fire, and lysis basically meaning to break apart. Using extreme heat to crack wood into gaseous, flammable products. That's what gasification is. And early experiments with gasification date back to the late 1600s. I know, right? It freaks me out too, thinking about somebody going, because somebody who's looking at wood going, wait a minute, I'll bet you if we heat this wood up in a very low oxygen environment, which is critical, then I'll bet we can get it to off-gas some flammable materials, and we can use that. That was being done in like the 1690s, right? It wasn't, and it was continuously experimented with through the 1700s and the 1800s until the very end of the 1800s and getting into the early 1900s, when people started experimenting with vehicles like, internal combustion engines. One of the things that you will see is, like, there's a couple of old films, and you can see pictures of it on the interwebs, of a truck that essentially has a furnace in the bed of the truck, and it's got a smokestack, and it's smoking, and it's driving down like this country road. And it's using the products of gasification. It is a gasifier that's strapped to an internal combustion engine, and it's using the flammable gases from the process to actually burn in the internal combustion engine. I always thought that this was all a bunch of hooey. I really did. I was like, this is impossible. There's no way that you can do this. But what is wood? Honestly, when you get down to it, what is wood? It's essentially sugar. What is sugar? Well, it's a carbohydrate. Okay, what's a carbohydrate? Well, there's carbon and oxygen and hydrogen in sugar, and all of which are combustible. So here's how this gasification process works. Dried biomass from the drying silos is transferred into the gasification process. It is a low or no oxygen environment and it is the mass is heated to extreme temperatures. Well, not extreme. Somewhere between 500 degrees Celsius, or 500 C and 800 Celsius is sort of the sweet spot for the production of biochar and gases that I can utilize in other things. But that's 500 C is really the sweet spot. You get a lot of flammable gas and you get a lot of biochar. If I raise the temperature up further than that, I get a lot more, or I get a lot less biochar, but I get a lot more flammable gases. If I decrease that temperature, I get a lot more biochar, but less flammable gases. There's a lot of research on this, and it depends on what you want the outputs to be. I like the middle road. I want as much biochar as I can get without sacrificing how much flammable gases that I can get. So you heat the chamber up, and this can be done either as a batch process where you just load up what's called a retort, that's the word that you use for the chamber that is low oxygen, has the wood in it, and then you basically bake the shit out of it over an open flame or some other kind of heat source until it gets up to temperature. Then it starts producing these gases, because what's going on is that the carbohydrates of the wood, which is made out of cellulose, lignin, and hemicellulose, those are all essentially sugars, except the way that they're arranged, the way that they're bonded to each other becomes very, very strong. But they're still essentially sugar. So when you look at a tree, what you're looking at is a massive stack of sugar. The whole tree, like leaves, except for the protein part in trees, which is actually kind of minimal. The majority of a mass of a tree is essentially a big old bag of sugar, right? Under high heat, those molecules of sugar start to crack and gases start to pour off of them. So when you light a match, you're not really burning the wood. It amazed me when I figured this out, because I kept looking at a burning match going, it doesn't even look like the flame is really touching the wood. It's like there's a space between. That's gasification. That's what's going on in your fireplace. If you're using a fireplace that uses like wood chips, if you're lighting a match, if you're burning a candle, it all operates on the same process. You provide an initial heat source, just enough to get either like the wax of a candle or the wood to start vaporizing. And the flame is converting that flammable vapor into the flame that you actually see and the heat that comes off of that. The same thing happens in the gasification process. You control the heat, you limit the oxygen because otherwise you'll get a flame. That's why pyrolysis is the word to use instead of burning wood in a retort. We're not doing that. We're pyrolyzing, and there's very much of a difference. What we're producing, this flammable gas, it's called syngas or synthesis gas, and it's composed of essentially the following: about 60% of that gas is pure hydrogen in the form of H2. Remember the Hindenburg? Hydrogen is extremely flammable. That's why after the Hindenburg, the dirigibles or airships or blimps, as we've come to know them in the modern times, they don't use hydrogen anymore. They used it because hydrogen is very light. It's lighter than air. If you fill a bunch of tanks with hydrogen and strap it to a metal frame and then cover the whole damn thing in some fabric, you've got the Goodyear blimp. Now, that's what it is. Except we don't use hydrogen anymore because of the Hindenburg accident. If you have never seen the Hindenburg burn, go look at that and tell me that hydrogen isn't flammable and useful as a heat source. It is. 15% of syngas is carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. Amazingly enough, carbon monoxide is highly flammable. It's very flammable. Why? Because it's very reactive. Carbon monoxide is basically in a state where it needs to accept another oxygen atom. It really wants another oxygen atom. It needs to get oxidized. And the best way, like when you're looking at a flame, you're looking at a massive oxidation reaction. So carbon monoxide wants to become carbon dioxide, and it does that in a process of burning in an oxygen environment, right? That's after we produce the syngas. We'll get to that, I promise. The last major component, because there's basically 3 components to syngas. The last major component is anywhere between 0 and 5% methane. And I don't have to explain that to you. That's CH4. It is highly flammable. We use methane all the time. It's basically natural gas. You know, and it's highly flammable. I don't have to explain this to you. So highly flammable hydrogen, highly flammable carbon monoxide, and highly flammable methane. That's what gets out of the gasification process. Along with the heat of that process, which needs to be dumped somewhere, and hello drying silos, as I've said before, you also get biochar, and you also get wood vinegar. So what do we do with the syngas from the gasification process? We make electricity out of it. And heat. What the hell do you think we do with it? The syngas leaves the gasifier. Right? We've got essentially what happens is that even though we're not allowing air into the system, as the wood products and the lignin and hemicellulose and celluloses and all that good stuff, as it breaks down and becomes gas, it essentially will pressurize inside that burn chamber, right? And I need to back up one thing. There's a batch process for gasification where you basically lock it all into a retort, but there are also systems that are continuous feed systems. That would be the one that I would want to use for the Cathedral Project, is the continuous feed system, where you basically put wood on a conveyor belt, wood particles on a conveyor belt, it goes into the gasifier, and biochar, syngas, and heat comes out the other side in a continuous stream. That's what we want. We don't really want the batch process, because that's a lot more labor than what we're looking for, right? So we want the continuous feed process, and those occur. So in that continuous feed process, we're still pyrolyzing wood in a low oxygen environment. And syngas and heat and biochar are still leaving that system. But the syngas is kind of dirty, and it's also kind of hot. And the thing about it is that, like, let's go back to the internal side of the retort. If we're looking at the batch process, if we can't get the gas out of that burn chamber or the pyrolysis chamber, it's going to explode. It's going to pressure up to the point like a pressure cooker. And if the pressure gets too high, it's going to explode. So there's essentially a pipe that comes out of the retort that allows syngas to leave so that you're not overpressurizing the system. Some of that syngas is actually used to keep the chamber hot at that 500 degree Celsius temperature. But you don't need all of it. In fact, you don't need all that much of it to do that. So the rest of it would actually end up being waste. And we take that waste and we run it into a biofilter, right? Because we don't want to throw that gas directly into a fossil fuel burning internal combustion engine without cleaning it up. So we run it through a biofilter, which in itself, after it gets dirty enough and no longer is filtering, we just reprocess it through the burn process or through the pyrolysis process. Like let's say I've been using a biofilter for a couple of days. It gets all gummy with all the tars and all the rest of the bullshit that it's pulling out of the gas, and we just replace it. We replace the innards of the biofilter with a new biofilter, and we take that old biofilter and we just put it back into the pyrolysis process. It just, everything, there's no waste here. Not yet, anyway. What is the biofilter made out of? amazingly enough, very fine sawdust and wood chips and a couple of other things that are completely organic. I don't need to order anything like that is like a synthetic thing, like I don't know, like some kind of polymer. I don't need that. I just need to run it through enough sawdust and wood chips that it cools down and condenses some stuff out of it. And by that time, the gas that it ends up on the other side of the biofilter is essentially ready to burn, right? But what's beautiful about this is that the biofilter, the innards of it, because it's sawdust and wood, guess what? I've got the ability to produce that on site because I'm chipping in, like I could have a little grinder because I don't need much. I don't need much of this stuff to actually make a good biofilter. So I've got like a little grinder, make a couple of pounds or maybe 5 or 10 pounds of sawdust out of the whole thing by grinding some wood chips down. And boom, I've got the ability to replace my biofilter every single day if I want. And I don't have to buy anything for it because I'm using the very same feedstock that the rest of the system depends on. So now that we've got conditioned syngas that is of a much lower temperature than as it left the gasifier, I run that directly into a modified internal combustion engine, and that engine rotates a shaft, and that shaft is connected to an electrical generator. And I can produce direct current, or I could produce alternating current, AC, if I have some, like I get an electrician out there and he conditions the direct current with an inverter to AC, which is the same thing that you would do for solar panels. All right, so I can get DC or I can get AC. It doesn't matter. I'm getting electricity. That electricity is used to run the chipper, shredder, the tub grinder when I need to actually grind anything. It also could run the conveyors and feed systems, whether I'm feeding input stock into the drying silos or I'm pulling it out of the drying silos and throwing it into the gasifier system. I can use the electricity generated to do that. I can use the electricity to run fans and blowers. And that the fans and blowers would be to take the heat from all the heat generating parts of the carbon group and funnel them into the drying silos. I could run pumps if I needed pumps. I could, gas cleaning equipment, whatever. Controls, like in any other supporting machinery, like computers or, sensors or anything like in any of those issues. But I can also run Bitcoin miners as a flexible electrical load. What does that mean? What if I'm producing too much electricity? Like I'm not running the stump grinder. I'm not running like any of the chippers. I'm not, I'm running, maybe I'm just running conveyor belts, getting dried biomass out of one of the 3 or 4 drying silos and feeding it to the gasification process. And I'm overproducing electricity. I'll just feed it to Bitcoin miners. It'll consume any excess generated electricity. It's a power soak. That's what we call it. Matching mining capacity to available power is going to be kind of a deal. That's like, well, how do you do that? Well, you don't know until the system's built. Until we get farther, until my mind catches up with the rest of me and can get farther along with actually running numbers. Because it may be that it's possible that there may not be enough electricity to run any Bitcoin mining. It may be that one container full of S9 miners or S22 miners isn't enough miners to soak up the excess energy. There's still real work that needs to actually be done when it comes to, does this system merit investment? That kind of thing. But before we even get there, there's other things that we need to talk about. Like, well, I can almost say one number. How much electricity might we be able to produce? Well, it turns out that given a certain amount of input load, like from wood, I know that approximately 1 megawatt of continuous net power could operate from a few truckloads of wood every day. Like I could get a generator that produces 1 megawatt. And I know that there are gasification systems in place around the country that after I think it's about 3 or 4 dump trucks of chipped wood will run 1 megawatt of power production for 24 hours. Now, that there's going to be plus or minus errors on either side of that. However, I'm just kind of looking at a 1 megawatt situation. And it happens that 1 megawatt could potentially operate roughly one 40-foot container, like a shipping container, that contains between 250 and 300 modern miners. 250 to 300 modern miners isn't anything to sneeze at. And if it's part of a pool, if it's a part of a mining pool, I don't even need to worry about hitting a Bitcoin. As long as I'm providing hash power as part of a pool, I can take some revenue from that. And I'm under no obligation to operate it continuously. So if I need extra power to run a chipper or the tub grinder or something else, I can take that electrical load away from the Bitcoin miners. Because at this point, it's not the Bitcoin mining piece of this isn't the end goal for the carbon group of the Cathedral system. It's just like, if I have excess power, I would rather mine Bitcoin with it and support the network and make revenue in Bitcoin from that, because I'm part of a pool and they would pay me back, partial, fractions of a Bitcoin on an hour over hour basis, depending on how the pool is actually worked out. And I can store that Bitcoin on the balance sheet of the entire situation, or for the entire company, or however the cathedral ends up getting structured. I can keep Bitcoin on the balance sheet that way without actually purchasing it, right? So it's not the goal. It's a way to utilize what might actually be considered waste, like excess electricity. What do you do with it? In modern grids, you just basically burn it off as heat. If there is any left, there used to be, maybe not quite anymore with all the AI data centers going in, but it's possible that I might generate too much electricity and I don't want to waste it. So I would pump it into a Bitcoin mining container. That's where the Bitcoin mining thing comes into play. So now there's 3 different ways that I could do that. I could own the miners and the container, and I could mine on my own, and I could keep all the Bitcoin if I hit a Bitcoin, or I could rent it. I could literally rent it and share the Bitcoin, whether or not we're mining on our own or we're part of a pool. I could keep a percentage of the net Bitcoin owned as part of the rental agreement with those who actually built the mining rig and dropped it off at the Cathedral Project. Or I could lease the power and the land site to a miner, but I wouldn't actually own any Bitcoin. But I would get fiat cash for the lease. It's okay, it's $100 a month or whatever. You're responsible for the mining rigs. You're responsible for the maintenance. You're responsible for everything. I'm just going to guarantee you this much power, with the agreement that there may be a time that you're not getting that much, like the agreement of X amount of power comes with you are the excess energy soak, right? And if that agreement cannot be reached with one mining company, somebody out there might want to do it. I'm just saying that there's multiple ways to skin that particular cat. I can own everything, or I could rent everything, or I could just lease the power to somebody else who owns everything. And how those deals work depends on how the deal is made. But mining heat is still an output. You still got to cool those miners, which means you got to take the heat away. And that heat as a waste product is not a waste. It goes to the drying silos to perform a function. This brings us to heat recovery and the internal energy looping idea, because heat is a product. It's not a waste. I cannot hammer that home enough. Heat is a productive source of energy. It's just that it's chaotic. Hot air is extremely hard to wrangle and get something done out of it. But in this particular case, hot air is exactly what I want. And again, this is what permaculture teaches. How do we look at waste not as something to be dumped and gotten, rid of, but something that we can utilize? And the carbon group has 3 heat sources. Remember, the gasifier produces a lot of heat. The generator also produces a lot of heat, but probably not as much as the gasification process. And then the Bitcoin miners are essentially low heat. After that heat, all collectively, and maybe I use the high heat for like the drying silo that is being loaded with fresh input, with fresh wood chips. Don't know what the moisture content is. Maybe I've got a situation where the gasification heat is the only heat source for that silo. And then as that silo gets to a certain moisture content, I switch it to the moderate heat from the gas generator, right? And it continues to dry, but not as, because you have to, the thing about it is in a continuous feed system, I have to continuously process wood. I've got to continuously put that processed wood into a single silo until it's filled to the top. That's a fresh silo. That needs to start the drying process as it's being loaded and and terminally when it gets full. And then by the time it is ready, by the time I've emptied the drying silo of its dried and prepared and 14% moisture wood, I've got to have another one in line to keep that continuous feed going. So maybe maybe there's 4 silos. There is an input silo and there's an output silo. And then there are 2 silos that represent, different stages of the drying process. And the high heat goes into the loading silo. The moderate heat goes into the full, the completely full silo that's down to around 20% moisture. And then it gets that silo in, or the third silo, the second silo in between the first and the last silo is on the lowest heat from the Bitcoin miners just to finish it off to make sure it's at 14% before it ends up in the terminal position to where it ends up getting harvested to put into the gasification process. So there's different kinds of heat, and I could use them all together. I could use them all separately. The point is that after the heat comes out of the drying silos, it's not like it's chilly air. It's still going to be hot. What do I do with that heat? I pump it into the greenhouse and the aquaponics systems because they need heat too, at least in the winter. And depending on where the system is, the winters could be longer or the winters could be shorter. In the heat of the summer in West Texas, I'm probably going to dump the heat. After the drying silo, is probably done its bit for king and country. And I can't figure out, if I can't figure out anything else to do with that heat, maybe I could run what's called a Stirling engine, which uses heat differentials to produce electricity in a different way than burning through an internal combustion engine and rotating a drive shaft to do a DC motor or a DC power generator. If I don't have time to get into the Stirling engine now, but look up Stirling engine. I think it's spelled with an I, Stirling, I think. But it's not outside the realm of possibility that in the summertime, that excess heat coming out of the drying silos could still be harvested to produce a little bit of electricity, but in a completely different way. But in the winter, I want that. I want everything I can get. And by the time it gets out of the greenhouse, it's pretty much spent. There's really not much you can do with it. But we've harvested all that energy along the way, right? If you want to, hold on for a second. I just lost my place. Let me get right back to it. Yeah. The heat distribution and storage. It's possible that I could store that heat in the summer for later use in the winter, but I don't have time to tell you about it right now. Here's what, if you want to look at somebody who is using biochar systems and utilizing the heat to run massive greenhouses, I want you to go look at go to YouTube and search Living Web Farms. Living Web Farms. And when you get there, search for biochar production. There's going to be several videos about biochar production. There's going to be webinars. There's going to be all kinds of stuff. But there's one in particular that you'll come across where it shows how they use heat exchange, a massive tank of water, and basically it runs a heat exchanger off of the gasifier and takes that heat and basically exchanges that heat again into a massive tank of water, and they store the heat in that tank of water, and they are able to harvest that heat from that tank later on. All right. Living Web Farms, and then search for biochar production. When you see it, you'll go, oh, okay, there's a lot of different ways to work with heat. But we don't have time right now. We got to move on. I've mentioned greenhouse and aquaponics and biochar and wood vinegar and other potential products. So turning energy inputs into biological production, we've talked about heat, talked about biochar a little bit. We'll get into it here in a sec. But there's also CO2 and condensates that come off, and these are all inputs for other productive systems, right? So here's a portfolio of interlocking products that are coming out of this. The Bitcoin, the fish, the greenhouse, and the aquaponic plants, the biochar. Potentially we get wood vinegar, which I'll talk about. We get improved soil fertility. That comes through the biochar. We've avoided any disposal costs because we don't need to ship our wood away. We want as much as we can get, and we want people to pay for dumping their wood on our place. We have greenhouse and aquaponics when we get to the greenhouse and aquaponics, we're going to have to do that in a completely different episode. I'm going to touch on, or I'm going to talk about it, but that needs to be its own deal. But biochar as a long-term fertility product. Okay, we've talked about heat, and we've talked about recycling the CO2, and we into the greenhouse and aquaponic systems. And again, I'll do a whole episode on that thing later. But it's like you've heard me say biochar. It's like, what is it? It's charcoal. It's just not the kind of charcoal that you would use to cook a hamburger on. By the time the gasification process completes, yeah, you get heat. Yeah, you get the syngas. Yeah, you get wood vinegar, which we'll get, but you also get biochar. And biochar is, if it's done right, it is pure. It is almost pure carbon. It's not ash, and it doesn't have any volatile chemicals left in it because it's all been sucked out, turned into syngas, and that's been burned in the generator. So all you're left with is essentially pure carbon, and quite a bit of pure carbon too. And I've extensively explained biochar and how it's good for the soil in Cathedral parts 1 through 5. But essentially, why we want carbon coming out of this, and it's not a waste product. In fact, we want this. This was one of the whole reasons that I put the carbon group into Cathedral in the first place, is that I want tons and tons and tons of biochar for application on the whole project of Cathedral, under the trees, on top of the grazing lanes for the cattle. I want it as deep in the soil as I can possibly get it, everywhere. I want tons of it, not pounds per acre, tons per acre. And the reason is this, that there used to be that when the Great Plains were first discovered by the early Americans, and we were, like whether it was part of the California gold rush or the land rush that came right before that, when people were hitting the Great Plains, they were seeing soils that were basically black. They were covered with grass, really tall grass. In fact, there's anecdotes from the explorer, the conquistador Cortez, and his group, and a lot of other groups that were exploring the early Americas, essentially at the kind of like before the colonies were done. They were describing grasslands in the Great Plains, and the grasses were so tall, it was coming up to their hips while they were on horses. That means the grass was like 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall. That's what the Great Plains used to look like. And the amount of carbon in the soil was projected to be around 17%. So, like, you pull out 1 pound or 1 kilogram of soil from the topsoil in the Great Plains in, let's say, 1690 or whatever it was, 17% of that volume is pure carbon. What does carbon do in the soil? Why do we give a shit? In terms of biochar, first, it is highly porous material, which means it's got a lot of surface area. That surface area allows attachment sites for various things that are important when it comes to fertility. One, and most importantly to me, is water. The water molecule is attracted to pure carbon. In the case of biochar has a slightly electronegative charge on it. Water has a slightly positive charge on one side of it. And the minute those two come into contact with each other, they stick like glue. It's not permanently bonded. The water molecule is not permanently bonded to the carbon, but it is definitely not going to evaporate. And if you get rain and you've got 17% carbon in the soil, you're going to retain a lot of water when there is a drought. And that's one of the critical issues that goes on with a system like Cathedral, because water is going to be utilized by the, millions of gallons a year, something like that. You don't need to be wasting any of it. You need to be able to capture as much as you can, and you need to be able to store it on site. And the best way to do that is with biochar to like as far down in the soil profile as you can get. 1 foot would be great. 2 foot would be better. 3 foot would be awesome if you can get down that far. It depends on how much topsoil you actually have to work with. But the point is, that's where all of this biochar is going to go. It's going to go in the ground. It's going to go on top of the ground. And I think I've got it to where I want the soils all across the Cathedral Project to be at least 20% pure carbon, mostly in the form of biochar, but also in other formats. And if you want those other formats, and I've talked about it before in previous Cathedral episodes, but I want 20 to 25%. After that, there's really not, I think that you'd follow the law of diminishing returns, because it's not just water that you're keeping. All plant nutrients that we know of, none of them have a negative charge. Isn't that odd? Like iron, magnesium, a little bit of selenium, all these micro and macronutrients. That includes like, urea or basically nitrogen fertilizers, phosphorus, calcium, everything that, potash, everything that you've ever heard, if you go look at look at the back of a package of Miracle Grow plant food. Every single one that is mentioned is a positively charged ion, also known as a cation. There's not any negative charges for nutrients that plants need. And it so happens that, like water, there's these positive charges stick onto the surface layers of biochar and remain there. And the plants that want to get that nitrogen off of that carbon has to do a little bit of work to get it, but it won't wash away. That's the important part. The water doesn't evaporate and the soil nutrients won't wash away as long as they're, associated, ionically associated with this biochar. That's why you want a shit ton of it and you want it deep in the soil profile. It would take at least a quarter of a century to get that much carbon back into the soils, because if I were to build this in, like, let's say the Panhandle of West Texas, do you have any idea what the carbon content of those soils after being farmed for this long are? I'll give you the answer. You'd be lucky to get anywhere approaching 2%. Not 17%, like in the days of the conquistador. No, we've fried all that shit. That's all gone because of plowing. No. You're be lucky to get 2%. In most cases, you're looking at it anywhere between sub 1% and 1.3% carbon that's left after 50 years of cotton farming, which is what you find in the Panhandle of Texas. Now, I'm looking at 20 to 25%. It's going to take years to get that in there. And I can use biochar for a lot of other stuff. So it's not just water. It's not just the positively charged plant, nutrients, which is basically all of them. It's also, the biochar also provides a home for mycorrhizal soil fungi, nematodes of all manner. So, most of nematodes are good. There's only a few bad ones, but bacteria, protozoa, and all of these things are critical for plant health, whether grasses, bushes, shrubs, trees. If it's got roots and it's growing in soil, 95% of whatever's growing in soil is actually 100% of things growing in soil is dependent on this, on these critters in the soil. 95% of them are dependent on mycorrhizal fungi. And this provides a nice, safe harbor. It's like think of a coral reef in the middle of, the Atlantic Ocean, right? There will be no life anywhere except around things like coral reef. Yeah, you'll see a couple of fish swim by every once in a while, but there's no food source there. There's no community there. There's no life there. Even fish. You look at what would constitute a desert on the seafloor where it's just sand. There's not much there. There's not much life. There's not many fish. There's not a whole lot of shit going on. You get around a coral reef, everything's different. That's what biochar in the soil does. Again, there's a lot more on that through the rest of the cathedral. I want to move on to wood vinegar. Wood vinegar is another product from this whole system, this gasification process. If you've ever seen liquid smoke in the store, that's wood vinegar. And I'm talking about the stuff that people use to make fake barbecue sauce. I don't use it myself, but wood vinegar is interesting. Essentially, it's water and a whole bunch of organic chemistry. There's a lot of organic molecules that didn't get into that after the gasification process essentially condensed out during the biofiltration process and the cooling, and it turns into liquid, and it's liquid smoke. That's how they make liquid smoke, is a gasification process. Burn wood and they condense the smoke, and that smoke essentially turns back into a brown liquid, and it has all manner of health benefits, not only to plants, but to humans. It's actually, amazingly enough, you would think that if I drink this whole thing of liquid smoke, I'm going to get cancer. That would probably be the response from most people. That's not true. It helps with ulcers. It helps with all kinds of stuff for digestion in mammals, but it's also like a topical solution, it's antimicrobial. It's antifungal. Well, I know it's problematic because if I dump it on the soil, it's like, well, will it kill all the fungus? No, it's not going to kill that much fungus. But if it's a wound on your arm, you know, liquid or wood vinegar is pretty good for it. It does all kinds of stuff for the plant. It's a growth hormone regulator. It also makes seeds germinate. It increases germination rates in seeds when you soak it in wood vinegar and then plant them. Right? There's all manner of stuff that wood vinegar does. And it is really good in the soil because of all of that. The fact that it's a germination engine, the fact that it cranks up growth hormones in plants. It does all kinds of neat stuff. So I would want to actually mix that with the biochar, let that wood vinegar soak into the biochar along with a whole bunch of other stuff, and then distribute it into the soil or on top of the soil. So there's another product. It's not waste. I'm not throwing any of this stuff away. It's going back out into the fields. It's going to be sprayed on tree leaves. I'm going to do all kinds of stuff with it because it is extremely useful. And I'm not throwing it away. And all of this, like for instance, like after I got finished, like let's say that I get it all the way up to 25% pure carbon in the soil, I can start selling it because I don't need any more. Again, you start using the law of diminishing returns. Now it's probably more, it's worth more to me to put into bags and sell it to other farmers or sell it to other ranchers or sell it to feedstock producers, because when you feed things like animals, cows especially, ruminants, you feed it biochar along with their salt mix or general feed at a rate of like 10%. Like, so if I feed my cow a pound of hay, then I want 1/10 of a pound of biochar mixed in with that hay. And guess what happens? It absorbs all the methane that is produced in the gut that cows burp out, that all the people that are freaking out about cows farting methane, they don't fart methane. They burp it, for one. But it's going to destroy the atmosphere? Nah, feed them biochar, dude. It soaks it all up, throws it into the soil, keeps it there because methane has some positive charge on it, positive charge on it, and it will stick to the biochar. There are bacteria in the soil all over the place that specifically break down methane into CO2 and hydrogen, and they harvest the energy from the chemical bonds. So methane no more. That's just a side feature, but it becomes worth it for me to bag and sell. And not only that, at the very end of all this, I can sell carbon credits to the market. Why? Because I can prove how much carbon I've sequestered in the ground, because once biochar is in the soil, it's never going anywhere else for 10,000 years. Some people will say at least 100 years. Yeah, right. No, unless you dig it up and expose it to oxygen for a long period of time, that carbon in the form of biochar is not going anywhere. It's just, like you literally have to light it on fire, and that after you mix it with soil, it's not so easy to do that. If you expose it to oxygen, eventually it will oxidize and turn into CO2. But as long as you keep it inside the soil and you don't do things like plow or disc or anything like that, well, it's going to stay there for thousands of years. And that is a parameter for being able to sell carbon credits on the open market. And you might say, David, I think this climate change is a hoax. I don't care if it's a hoax or not. If somebody wants to pay me $100 per ton of carbon equivalents that I can prove that I shoved into the ground, I will take that $100. And they can buy and they can trade carbon credits in Europe all day long. I don't care. I'm not leaving money on the table. So after I've gotten all of this out, I can still make yet more revenue by selling carbon credits, because I can prove how many carbon equivalents I produced, how many carbon equivalents I've sequestered in the soil, and I can prove that it's going to be there for 1,000 years at least. because we have scientific studies that, like the terra preta soils, that are high carbon soils that were built by mankind, by the Amazonian tribes in the rainforest. We know that what they built, we know when they built those. We know when those pits that were filled with burnable materials were ignited. We know that they covered them with soil to let them basically smolder in a low oxygen environment. And we know it created these high carbon soils called terra preta. And we know they did that over 1,000 years ago. And that carbon is not only still there, it's actually increasing in mass, which is a different deal that I don't have time to get into. So we know at least 1,000 years. So I can prove everything I need to prove to be able to sell carbon credits on the open market. And I still got all the benefits that I just listed off. So that's sort of what the carbon group is supposed to do as it's sort of the centerpiece of the entire Cathedral Project. Without it, the Cathedral Project won't work. I need all of these items in the carbon group. I need wood vinegar produced. I need to have biochar produced. I need energy production in the form of heat and electricity. And the carbon group does all of it. I need to be able to get rid of my waste wood. The carbon group does that for me. I need to be able to make revenue by harvesting municipalities' wood sources and saying, bring it to us. We'll charge you $50 tipping fee or whatever it happens to be, whatever is like, make sure they bring it to us before they bring it to somebody else. It keeps it out of the landfills. Hell, I might be able to sell, it's not in the landfill credits on the open market. I don't know. But you get what I'm saying. It's harvesting every single thing that you can harvest. Any sources of revenue that you can find. And the carbon group is one of the most interesting parts of Cathedral because it's able to harvest and reharvest and reharvest and reharvest either something productive or something that will generate a revenue over and over and over and over and over again with almost no waste. That's what I love about the carbon group section of the Cathedral Project. So the central question, I hope we've answered. Now, if you don't remember what that was, I said at the very top of the episode. Cathedral turns biomass into energy, fertility, food, useful products, and revenue. The central question was, how do we get rid of all this stuff and what can we do with it and why or how? So here's the whole chain. Let's go like from the left side of the flow chart that I told you about at the top of the show all the way to the last. Biomass enters the system. The material is chipped and then dried. The gasifier separates it into useful product streams. The syngas becomes electricity. The electricity powers the whole system and mines Bitcoin if there's excess. The heat is recovered. Biochar, carbon dioxide, fish, plants, and other products re-enter the wider cathedral economy. It's like a cascade. We had to prune and process the residues anyway. Might as well return it to the carbon group as future feedstock. The generated heat dries all that fuel and supports, which ends up supporting food production even after it's dried all the future fuel. Electricity running the equipment, creates Bitcoin revenue if there's too much electricity. The CO2 is harvested to produce greenhouse plants. The biochar returns all this carbon to the soil and all the wonderful things that biochar does to soil. And I get it for free. In fact, people are paying me to do this. When you look at it, people are literally paying me to take their municipal wood waste and turn it into something that I would literally have to buy if I didn't have the carbon group, so that I could put it in the soil so I could retain water, nutrients, and provide a high quality home for all the soil critters that are essential for plant life in the first place. And we've got a lot of plant life on Cathedral. There's 5 different kinds of trees. There's 100 different kinds of hedgerows or species in hedgerows. There's 12 different grasses. Actually, there should be more than that. In the grazing lanes. This thing is a giant root system. And all these roots are going to be connected to all this biochar, and all the fertility that biochar connect or provides a resting place for. You can think of it as a battery, a water battery, nutrient battery, microbiology battery. It's also a huge pH buffer, so it really helps control any potential issues with pH in the soil if things, get weird. But in either event, it does all that. And Bitcoin mining, it's not the final purpose of this system. That's what I keep trying to tell myself is that this isn't about Bitcoin. This is how Bitcoin can fit in to the system, and it fits in two places. The Bitcoin mining to soak up any excess electricity generated from the gasification process, and two, provide a balance sheet exposure to the hardest money ever thought of ever. Now, there's a lot of problems here. We still need to look, what kind of volume of feedstock can be generated from the cathedral system itself? Unknown. I can theorize. I can, get AI to help me theorize, and I'm kind of in the middle of doing that. But this system doesn't exist. Nothing like this has ever been built. So there's no hard facts as to how much wood, after everything is said and done on a year-over-year basis, how much wood is produced just out of the cathedral system itself. What kind of gasifier, what manufacturer, what temperatures to do the pyrolysis at. Is a biofilter the best way to clean the gas as it comes out? What about the heat demand? How many calories of heat does it take to get freshly cut wood or chipped wood down to a moisture content of 14%? It's a lot of math that's left to look at. What kind of scale of equipment are we talking about? Well, that depends on how much volume of external and internal feedstock is produced, and other issues. Quality control of the biochar. If I sell it to the public, I'm going to have to send samples off to a lab continuously to get it checked for heavy metals or some kind of weird contaminant that I didn't know was in the feedstock. That's a problem. The product market fit. Will I actually be able to sell the biochar to somebody else? Can I convince a rancher that 10% added into the feed of that rancher's animals is going to produce less methane and better performance of the animal itself? By the way, that actually has been proven. You feed 10% biochar to ruminants, and their performance, their weight gain, everything about that, their general health, it all increases. And you're reducing methane. So you make the people that think we're all going to die because of cattle, you at least assuage some of their fears, right? But a lot of stuff has to be proven. A lot of math has to be done. But at the end of all this, the carbon group is the Cathedral Project's heartbeat. But it's more than just the heartbeat. I used to think of it as the heartbeat, just the heartbeat. The one thing that makes everything fit together is the carbon group. So therefore it had to be the heartbeat. But there's another way to look at it. You can look at the carbon group as the Cathedral Project's core metabolism generator. Metabolism is how we, and plants and animals, whether bird or cow, tree, bush, grass, it doesn't matter. We all have metabolism, and it's the ability to be able to take in certain items, and those are converted and harvested for energy to do other things like build proteins or run the mitochondria to get energy, whatever is in the living system that needs to be done is basically built on metabolism. If you don't have functional metabolism, you have problems. And if you want to know what kind of problems humans can have with jacked up metabolism, Google metabolic health issues in humans, and prepare to be kind of freaked out. So this provides the core structure for all of the metabolism that will eventually be prevailing in the cathedral system. The point is not simply to extract energy from wood. The point is to keep that energy and carbon moving through cathedral for as long and as productively as possible. That's the end of the presentation. I hope I just didn't confuse the living snot out of everybody, because, you know, these are some difficult concepts, even for me. And I've got my head shoved so far up this thing's rear end, I can't see straight. I mean, it's how much I've learned about carbon at the molecular level. I've gone down literally to how is a carbon atom actually formed? By the way, that comes from beryllium, but I won't get into it. So if I've been knee deep in this for the many years that I've been in, then somebody who's just now coming to all this, it wouldn't surprise me if you're confused. You know, it's like, and I do my best to present these kinds of materials in a way that makes sense, that gives you a little bit deeper background into some of these things, but I can't give it all to you. Not in, you know, how long we've been going, and over an hour and a half. And there's so much more to pull apart. That's why this is the 6th, at least, you know, over an hour long episode. I think all these episodes are well over an hour long, except I think one of them. I think one of the cathedral episodes is right at an hour. But most of them are way longer, and they could be even longer than that. But I want to do that. That's why I'm making this whole thing into parts. But the carbon group is the centerpiece of cathedral. It's not sexy. It's a little grimy, because if you've ever, you know, been messing around with charcoal, you know how dirty that can get. Although this charcoal is actually so clean, you could literally run your hands. You could take a handful of biochar and scrub it between your hands, right? And the palms of your hands would be all black. And if you were to go to a hand sink with no soap, and you run your hands underwater and you rub them a little bit, all of that carbon is going to come off. If you try to do that with, like, you crush up some charcoal out of a bag of, like, I don't know, Royal Oak charcoal, and you do the same thing, you're not getting it off without like a bar of Soap Miner brand soap. You know, because there's a lot of hydrocarbons that are still in there. In biochar, those hydrocarbons, they all got pulled out in the gasification process. It's clean. It's really, really clean carbon. And all the rest of the things that the carbon group does, harvesting and reharvesting revenue, harvesting and reharvesting heat, harvesting and at least harvesting CO2 and passing it on to the greenhouse and aquaponic systems. But it's this way of making sure that, did you really get everything that you possibly could out of that initial what would be a waste stream? Remember, our inputs we start out with using inputs that most people consider waste. I don't care. They'll put it into a landfill. They'll, you know, maybe some people that, you know, that are a little bit more attuned will say, well, if I got a chipper, I've got so many trees on my property. If I got a chipper, I can make my own mulch. Okay, that's a good use for it. I'm not going to lie. That is actually an excellent use. Mulch is a great use for wood chips. But a lot of people don't have that. You know, a lot of most people that live in cities that have enough property to have trees, if they drop a branch, they just throw it in the dumpster. And that dumpster gets emptied into a bigger dumpster, and that dumpster ends up rolling up to a landfill, and it gets dumped in there. And then as it decomposes, you get shit like methane. Because this stuff is going to decompose in an oxygen environment, whether I speed it up with pyrolysis or not. So the way that the carbon group works is it begins with what most people begin or think of as waste. Then I take what most people consider waste and we convert it into several different things. And waste products from those several different things are not waste. They're inputs to other things. And that waste is utilized into other things. It's just, I love the carbon group part of the Cathedral Project because of that. Now, the whole project, the whole Cathedral Project operates on those same principles, but this is a concentrated view of the way that you start with what other people consider waste, and you basically convert the whole damn thing into nothing but product. And the only real waste that comes out of this system is low-grade heat. Because after a while, you can't even utilize what's left of the heat. I've used it to dry. After the air comes through all the wood, it goes to a greenhouse and heats it. And after that, man, it's pretty much done. That's it. That's the exhaust. That is the only exhaust from the carbon group. Everything else is retained. And it begins with waste. And it literally treats everything that could be considered waste as an input. And the only thing that is truly waste is that exhaust out of the greenhouse and aquaponic systems in the wintertime. And in the summertime, you don't even, if you're in West Texas, you're not going to heat a greenhouse. You're going to want to figure out a way to cool that. And maybe that's what has to happen. Maybe I use the residual heat to heat water, because hot water, as you flow that into evaporative cooling systems like you would find in a greenhouse, the water that drips down the mat and there's fans behind it. If you start out with hot water, amazingly enough, it actually cools better because you're closer to its evaporation point. So there's still a way. There's still a way to harvest a little bit of energy. How far do we want to go? But there's just no waste out of the carbon group. So I hope you found this interesting. If you did and you want to know more, make sure you go to bitcoinand.com and click on the Cathedral tab up at the top. You'll get to all the rest of the shows I've done about Cathedral. Until next time, I'll see you on the other side. This has been Bitcoin and I'm your host, David Bennett. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and hope to see you again real soon. Have a great day.